I never thought a simple school photo day would become the moment that changed everything for my family. My name is Sarah, I'm 28 years old, and I work as a registered nurse at our local hospital. For the past 3 years, I've been raising my son Tommy as a single mother after his biological father walked out on us when Tommy was just 4. 6 months ago, I married David, a wonderful man who loves Tommy like his own son. But David's father, Robert, has never accepted our marriage or considered Tommy his real grandson. Robert is a 65-year-old retired bank manager who prides himself on traditional family values. From the moment David introduced us, Robert made it clear that he saw Tommy as an obstacle to the proper family David should have. He's the type of man who believes blood is everything and that stepchildren are just temporary inconveniences. What happened on that Tuesday morning in October would expose just how far his prejudice could go. Tommy had been excited about school photo day for weeks. At 7 years old, he's a bright, energetic kid with sandy brown hair and David's kind eyes. He'd been practicing his smile in the mirror and had picked out his favorite blue button-down shirt the night before. As I helped him get ready that morning, brushing his hair and straightening his collar, he chattered excitedly about how all the kids in his second-grade class would be in the big group photo together. "Mom, do you think Grandpa Robert will see me in the photo when they put it in the yearbook?" Tommy asked innocently, using the title David had encouraged him to use. Despite Robert's obvious discomfort with it, my stomach tightened. I'd learned that Robert had volunteered to help with photo day logistics, something that had worried me since I'd heard about it, but I forced a smile and kissed Tommy's forehead. "Of course, sweetheart, you're going to look so handsome." What I didn't know was that Robert had been planning something that would shatter my little boy's heart and ignite a firestorm that would consume our entire family. The signs had been there from the beginning, but I'd tried to give Robert the benefit of the doubt. During our first family dinner after David and I got engaged, Robert had pointedly asked David when he was going to settle down and start a real family. When I mentioned Tommy's accomplishments in school, Robert would change the subject or find an excuse to leave the room. At our wedding reception, Robert had given a toast that conspicuously omitted any mention of Tommy, referring only to David's future children and the legacy he would leave behind. When family photos were taken, Robert consistently positioned himself so that Tommy was either out of frame or partially obscured. David, wanting to keep peace, had brushed off my concerns, saying his father just needed time to adjust. The pattern continued through every family gathering. At Tommy's 7th birthday party, Robert arrived late and left early, spending most of his time on his phone. When Tommy excitedly showed him a drawing he'd made at school, Robert barely glanced at it before handing it back with a dismissive, "That's nice." At Thanksgiving, Robert had loudly discussed his hopes for David's future sons, while Tommy sat right there at the kids' table, his little face growing more confused with each pointed comment. The most painful incident had happened. Just 2 weeks before photo day, Tommy had made the honor roll at school and was bursting with pride. When he ran to show Robert his certificate, Robert had looked at it and said, "Well, I suppose that's good for someone like you." The way he'd said it, with that particular emphasis, had made my blood boil. Tommy didn't understand the insult, but I did. David had finally spoken up that day, telling his father that Tommy was part of our family now, but Robert had just shrugged and muttered something about playing house. I should have seen what was coming. Robert's behavior had been escalating, becoming more pointed and cruel, but I never imagined he would target a child so publicly, so deliberately. I never thought he would use his position of authority at the school to humiliate my son in front of his classmates and teachers. The call came at 10:47 a.m. while I was reviewing patient charts during my break at the hospital. The school secretary's voice was tense and apologetic. "Mrs. Sarah, this is Linda from Oakwood Elementary. We're having a situation with Tommy during photo day, and we need you to come in if possible." My heart immediately started racing. What kind of situation? Is he hurt? "No, ma'am, he's not injured, but he's very upset and asking for you. There's been an incident with one of our parent volunteers, and Tommy is refusing to participate in any more photos." I was already grabbing my keys and heading for the door. "I'll be right there." The drive to Tommy's school felt like an eternity. My mind raced through possibilities. Had he gotten sick? Had another child been mean to him? The secretary had mentioned a parent volunteer, and a cold dread settled in my stomach as I remembered Robert's involvement in the day's activities. When I arrived at Oakwood Elementary, I could see the photos set up in the gymnasium through the windows, professional lighting, backdrop stands, and groups of children lined up in their best clothes. But something was wrong. I could see clusters of adults talking in hushed, concerned tones, and there was an intention in the air that had nothing to do with typical photo day chaos. Linda, the school secretary, met me at the front desk with a grim expression. Mrs. Sarah, Tommy is in the counselor's office with Mrs. Henderson, his teacher. Before you see him, I think you should know what happened. She led me down the hallway, speaking in low tones. Your father-in-law, Mr. Robert, was helping coordinate the class photos this morning. Everything was going normally until we got to Tommy's class. When the photographer was setting up the second grade group shot, Mr. Robert approached him and said there had been a mistake, that Tommy shouldn't be in the photo. I stopped walking. What do you mean, shouldn't be in the photo? Linda's face was flushed with obvious discomfort. He told the photographer that Tommy wasn't actually a student here, that there had been some kind of enrollment error. When Mrs. Henderson tried to correct him, he became insistent. He physically guided Tommy away from the group and told him to sit on the side. The hallway seemed to spin around me. He removed my son from his class photo. It gets worse, Linda continued, her voice barely above a whisper. When we moved on to the individual portraits, Mr. Robert again intervened. He told our photo coordinator that Tommy's individual photos shouldn't be processed because there were billing issues. With his account, Mrs. Henderson had to step in and override him, but by then, Tommy was crying and asking why he couldn't be in pictures with his friends. By the time we reached the counselor's office, I was shaking with rage. Through the small window in the door, I could see Tommy sitting in a chair that looked too big for him, his carefully chosen shirt wrinkled, his face red and puffy from crying. Mrs. Henderson, his teacher, was kneeling beside him, speaking softly and offering him tissues. When I opened the door, Tommy looked up with such relief and heartbreak that it nearly brought me to my knees. Mommy, he cried, launching himself into my arms. I don't understand why Grandpa Robert said I can't be in the pictures. Did I do something wrong? I held him tight, feeling his small body shake with confusion and hurt. Over his head, I met Mrs. Henderson's eyes, and I could see she was as angry as I was. Tommy didn't do anything wrong, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. What happened today was not okay, and it's not his fault. As I held Tommy and tried to comfort him, the full weight of what Robert had done began to sink in. This wasn't just another instance of coldness or passive rejection. This was deliberate, calculated cruelty directed at a 7-year-old child. Robert had used his position as a volunteer to systematically exclude my son from what should have been a normal, happy school experience. Tommy pulled back from our hug and looked at me with those big, trusting eyes that still believed adults would protect him and treat him fairly. Mommy, why did Grandpa Robert say I don't belong here? All my friends were in the picture, but he said I had to sit by myself. Mrs. Henderson tried to help me, but he said she was wrong. I struggled to find words that would comfort him without lying about the situation. How do you explain adult prejudice and cruelty to a child who's never done anything but try to love and be loved in return? Sometimes adults make very bad choices, sweetheart, I said, smoothing his hair. What Grandpa Robert did today was wrong, and it had nothing to do with you. You belong here. You belong in every picture, with your friends. You belong in our family. But even as I said the words, I could see the damage was already done. Tommy's confidence had been shaken. For the first time in his young life, he'd been made to feel like an outsider, like he didn't deserve the same treatment as other children. The worst part was that it had come from someone who was supposed to be family, someone he'd been taught to respect and trust. Mrs. Henderson filled me in on more details while Tommy sat quietly, still processing what had happened. Apparently, Robert had arrived early and immediately positioned himself as an authority figure, directing traffic and making decisions about photo arrangements. When Tommy's class had been called up, Robert had watched from the sidelines as the children arranged themselves for the group shot. Everything was going fine, Mrs. Henderson explained. The kids were excited. Tommy was right there with his friends Marcus and Lily, smiling and ready for the picture. Then Mr. Robert approached the photographer and started talking to him privately. The next thing I knew, the photographer was asking Tommy to step aside. She paused, clearly still upset by what she'd witnessed. I immediately went over to ask what was happening. Mr. Robert told me there had been an administrative error and that Tommy's participation needed to be verified. When I explained that Tommy was absolutely a registered student in my class, Mr. Robert became quite firm, saying he was handling the situation and that I should focus on managing the other children. The image of my son being singled out and removed while his classmates watched made my chest tight with fury. I could picture Tommy's confusion. The way he would have looked around for a familiar adult to help him understand what was happening. What did the other children do? I asked. Several of them asked where Tommy was going. Marcus actually tried to follow him, saying Tommy was his best friend and should be in the picture. I had to reassure the whole class that we would sort everything out, but you could see they were confused and upset, too. That detail hit me especially hard. Tommy's friends had tried to stand up for him, while the adult who should have been protecting him was actively working to exclude him. 7-year-olds had shown more integrity and loyalty than a 65-year-old man. By the time David arrived at the school, I'd called him immediately after getting the full story. I was beyond angry. I was in that cold, focused state that comes when someone threatens your child. David looked stricken when he saw Tommy's tear-stained face and heard what his father had done. "Dad's still here," David said quietly. "He's in the gymnasium, still helping with the other classes. I think we need to address this directly." I looked down at Tommy, who was finally starting to calm down in my arms. "Mrs. Henderson, would you mind staying with Tommy for a few minutes? I think it's time his grandfather and I had a conversation." The walk to the gymnasium felt like a march to battle. I could see Robert across the room, clipboard in hand, directing a group of kindergarteners into position for their class photo. He looked completely at ease, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if he hadn't just traumatized a child and disrupted an entire school's photo day. When he saw David and me approaching, something flickered across his face, not guilt or remorse, but annoyance, as if we were interrupting important work. "Robert," I said, my voice carrying across the gymnasium, in a way that made several other parent volunteers turn to look. "We need to talk now." He set down his clipboard with deliberate slowness, clearly intending to maintain his air of authority. "I'm quite busy here, Sarah. The photo schedule is very tight, and these children need proper supervision. The way you supervised my son." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was past caring about keeping my voice down. "The way you removed him from his class photo and told him he didn't belong here." Robert's jaw tightened. I was ensuring that the photos were accurate and appropriate. There are procedures to follow, and I was simply making sure everything was done correctly. David stepped forward, his face flushed with anger I'd rarely seen from him. "Dad, what you did was cruel and completely inappropriate. Tommy is my son. He's a student here, and he had every right to be in those photos." Robert's mask of professional authority began to slip, revealing the prejudice underneath. "He's not your son, David. He's Sarah's son from a previous relationship." I was trying to prevent confusion and maintain proper family records. The gymnasium had gone quiet around us. Other parents, teachers, and even some of the older children were watching our confrontation with wide eyes. I realized that Robert's actions hadn't gone unnoticed by others. There had been witnesses to everything he'd done. "Tommy is absolutely David's son," I said, my voice steady despite the rage coursing through me. "David adopted him legally 3 months ago, but even if he hadn't, Tommy is a student at this school, and you had no right to exclude him from anything." Robert's face reddened. "I don't care what papers you filed. That boy is not real family, and I won't pretend otherwise. David is wasting his time and energy on someone else's child when he should be focused on building a proper family with legitimate children." The words hung in the air like a slap. Several people around us gasped audibly. I heard someone whisper, "Did he really just say that?" But what struck me most was the look of absolute shock and shame on David's face, as he realized how deep his father's prejudice truly ran. In the aftermath of Robert's public declaration, something shifted in the room. What had started as a private family conflict had become a community issue. Mrs. Patterson, the school principal, appeared as if summoned by the tension, her expression grave as she took in the scene. "I think we need to move this conversation to my office," she said firmly, but her eyes were on Robert with obvious disapproval. It was clear she'd heard at least part of what he'd said. As we walked toward the principal's office, I noticed other parents whispering among themselves, their faces showing a mixture of shock and sympathy. Mrs. Henderson appeared with Tommy, who immediately ran to David and me, seeking the comfort and security that Robert had tried to strip away from him. In Mrs. Patterson's office, the full scope of what had happened became clear. She'd already spoken with the photographer, the photo coordinator, and several teacher witnesses. Robert's actions hadn't been subtle or easily misinterpreted. They'd been deliberate and witnessed by multiple school staff members. Mr. Robert, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades protecting children. Your behavior today was completely unacceptable. You used your volunteer position to discriminate against a student, caused emotional distress to a child, and disrupted our school's activities. Robert, perhaps realizing that his actions were going to have consequences beyond family drama, tried to backtrack. I was simply trying to help organize things efficiently. There may have been some miscommunication about procedures. There was no miscommunication, Mrs. Patterson replied sharply. Multiple staff members heard you explicitly state that Tommy didn't belong in the photos and shouldn't be treated as a legitimate student. That kind of discriminatory behavior has no place in our school. She turned to David and me. I want you to know that we will be retaking Tommy's class photo, and he will absolutely be included in all school publications and yearbook materials. We will also be reviewing our volunteer policies to ensure that something like this never happens again. Tommy, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up in a small voice. Does this mean I can be in the picture with Marcus and Lily? Absolutely, Mrs. Patterson said, her stern expression softening as she looked at him. You belong here, Tommy. You belong in every picture with your classmates. But I could see that the damage went deeper than a missed photo opportunity. Tommy's sense of security had been shaken. He'd learned that adults could be cruel and arbitrary, that belonging somewhere didn't necessarily protect you from rejection and humiliation. Over the next few days, word of what had happened spread through our community like wildfire. Parents who had witnessed Robert's behavior at the school began reaching out to offer support and share their own shock at what they'd seen. Mrs. Henderson called to check on Tommy and to let me know that several other teachers had approached her to express their outrage. I've been teaching for 15 years, she told me, and I've never seen anything quite like that. The deliberate cruelty of it, especially towards such a sweet child, just shocked everyone who witnessed it. Tommy was struggling to process what had happened. He'd become clingy and anxious, asking repeatedly whether he was really allowed to be in various places and activities. The confidence and security that David and I had worked so hard to build in him had been damaged by one morning of targeted cruelty. I arranged for Tommy to see the school counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who specialized in helping children deal with family trauma and rejection. She explained that what Tommy had experienced was a form of emotional abuse, and that his reactions were completely normal for a child who'd been deliberately excluded and humiliated. Children Tommy's age are still developing their sense of self and their understanding of where they belong, she explained to David and me. When an adult in a position of authority tells them they don't belong somewhere, it can be deeply damaging to their sense of security and self-worth. Meanwhile, my sister Jessica, who lived 2 hours away, drove down as soon as she heard what had happened. She'd always been protective of Tommy, and her fury at Robert's actions was immediate and fierce. I can't believe David's father would do something so cruel to a child, she said as we sat in my kitchen while Tommy napped, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the past few days. What kind of person deliberately humiliates a Jessica had always been my strongest supporter during the difficult years when I was raising Tommy alone. She'd been there for every milestone, every challenge, every moment when I'd doubted my ability to give Tommy everything he needed. Her validation of my anger and her immediate offer of support reminded me that Tommy and I weren't alone in this fight. You know what this is really about, she continued. It's not about school photos or procedures. Robert is trying to erase Tommy from the family, to make it clear that he doesn't consider him a real grandchild. He's using his age and authority to bully a child. She was right, and hearing it stated so clearly helped crystallize what I needed to do. This wasn't just about one bad day or a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with time and patience. This was about protecting my son from an adult who had demonstrated that he was willing to cause deliberate harm to a child in order to make a point about bloodlines and legitimacy. The email from Mrs. Patterson arrived on Friday afternoon, 3 days after the photo incident. The subject line read, "Follow-up regarding volunteer incident and policy changes." As I read it, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness that it had come to this. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Sarah, the email began, I am writing to follow up on the incident that occurred during our school photo day on Tuesday. After conducting a thorough investigation, including interviews with staff members and review of our volunteer policies, we have made several decisions regarding this matter. First, Mr. Robert has been removed from our approved volunteer list and will not be permitted to participate in any future school activities or events. His actions on Tuesday violated our policies regarding student welfare and created a hostile environment for one of our students. Second, we will be implementing additional training requirements for all parent volunteers to ensure they understand appropriate boundaries and behavior expectations when working with children in our school environment. Third, we have rescheduled Tommy's class photo for Monday morning, and we want to assure you that he will be prominently included in all group photos and individual portraits. We have also arranged for him to receive copies of all photos at no charge as an acknowledgement of the distress this situation caused. Finally, I want you to know that several community members have reached out to express their support for your family and their shock at what occurred. Our school community values inclusion and respect for all students, regardless of their family structure or background. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any concerns about Tommy's continued well-being at our school. We are committed to ensuring that he feels safe, valued, and fully included in all aspects of school life. I read the email twice, feeling a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, I was grateful that the school had taken decisive action, and that Tommy's rights as a student had been protected. On the other hand, I was heartbroken that it had been necessary at all, that my child had been forced to endure such treatment from someone who should have been a source of love and support. When David came home from work that evening, I showed him the email. He read it in silence, his face growing more troubled with each paragraph. "I can't believe it's come to this," he said finally. "I knew my father had issues with our marriage and with Tommy, but I never thought he would do something so public and cruel." We sat together on the couch, both of us processing the reality that our family dynamics had fundamentally changed. There was no going back from what Robert had done, no way to pretend it had been a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. "What do we do now?" David asked. "How do we move forward from this?" It was a question I'd been wrestling with since Tuesday morning. Part of me wanted to cut Robert out of our lives completely, to protect Tommy from any future incidents. But I also knew that David loved his father, despite everything, and that completely severing that relationship would cause its own kind of pain and complications. The conversation with David about boundaries and consequences was one of the most difficult we'd ever had as a couple. We sat at our kitchen table after Tommy had gone to bed, both of us emotionally drained but knowing we needed to make some hard decisions about our family's future. "I need you to understand something," I said, choosing my words carefully. "What your father did wasn't just mean or thoughtless. It was deliberately cruel to a child. He used his position of authority to humiliate Tommy in front of his classmates and teachers. That's not something I can forgive or forget." David nodded, his face heavy with shame and sadness. "I know, I've been replaying it in my mind all week, and I can't understand how he could do something so heartless. Tommy adores him, or at least he did. He's never done anything but try to win my father's approval. That's exactly what makes this so damaging," I continued. "Tommy trusted him. He called him Grandpa and tried so hard to make him proud, and Robert used that trust to hurt him in the most public way possible." We talked about the pattern of Robert's behavior, how it had escalated from passive coldness to active cruelty. We discussed the impact on Tommy, who was still asking anxious questions about whether he was really allowed to be places and do things. Most importantly, we talked about what kind of boundaries we needed to set to protect our son. "I think," David said slowly, "that my father can't have unsupervised access to Tommy anymore. What happened at the school proved that he can't be trusted to treat Tommy with basic respect and kindness." It was a painful admission for David to make, but I could see that he understood the necessity of it. Robert had demonstrated that his prejudice against Tommy was stronger than his love for his own son's happiness or his basic decency toward a child. "I also think," I added, "that Robert needs to acknowledge what he did and show genuine remorse before he has any access to Tommy at all. This can't be swept under the rug or dismissed as a misunderstanding. Tommy needs to see that adults will stand up for him and that actions have consequences." David agreed, though I could see how much it cost him to essentially choose between his father and his son. But that's exactly what Robert had forced him to do with his actions at the school. We decided that David would call his father the next day and explain our new boundaries. Robert would not be welcome in our home until he acknowledged the harm he'd caused and demonstrated genuine change in his attitude toward Tommy. He would not have any unsupervised time with Tommy, and any future interactions would be contingent on his ability to treat Tommy with the same respect and affection he would show any other grandchild. David's phone call with his father the next day went about as well as we'd expected, which is to say it was a disaster. I could hear Robert's raised voice through the phone from across the room, and David's face grew more and more strained as the conversation continued. "He's not taking any responsibility," David said after he hung up. "He keeps insisting that he was just trying to maintain proper standards and that we're overreacting. He actually said that Tommy should be grateful for the lesson in real-world expectations." I felt my anger flare again at the idea that Robert saw traumatizing a 7-year-old as some kind of character-building exercise. "What did you tell him about our boundaries?" I explained that he wouldn't be seeing Tommy until he could acknowledge what he did wrong and show genuine remorse. He didn't take it well. He accused me of choosing that woman and her child over my own family. The phrase stung, even though I'd expected something like it. In Robert's mind, Tommy and I would never be David's real family, no matter what legal documents said or how much love was involved. He also said, David continued reluctantly, that he's not going to pretend to be sorry for protecting family standards, and that if we want to play house with someone else's child, that's our choice, but he won't be part of it. So there it was. Robert had made his position clear. He would rather lose his relationship with his son than treat his grandson with basic human decency. It was heartbreaking and infuriating, but it was also clarifying. We now knew exactly where we stood and what we were dealing with. The hardest part was explaining to Tommy why Grandpa Robert wouldn't be coming to visit anymore. We tried to keep it age-appropriate, while still being honest about the fact that Robert's behavior had been unacceptable. "Sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people," I told Tommy as we sat together in his room. "When that happens, there have to be consequences, just like when you make a bad choice at school or at home." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he asked, "Did I make Grandpa Robert mad at me?" My heart broke a little more. "No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. Grandpa Robert made a choice to be unkind, and that's not your fault. You are a wonderful, lovable boy, and anyone who can't see that is missing out." In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Our community rallied around Tommy in ways I never could have anticipated. Parents from his school reached out to invite him to play dates and birthday parties. His teacher, Mrs. Henderson, went out of her way to make sure he felt special and included in classroom activities. Even parents I barely knew would stop me at the grocery store to ask how Tommy was doing and to express their outrage at what Robert had done. "What that man did was just wrong," said Carol, a mother of one of Tommy's classmates, when she approached me at the school pickup line. My daughter Emma came home talking about how sad Tommy looked when he couldn't be in the picture with everyone else. It broke my heart. These interactions reminded me that while Robert represented one kind of family, the kind based on blood and tradition and exclusion, there was another kind of family available to us, the kind based on choice and love and inclusion. Tommy was learning that lesson too, as he experienced firsthand how many people cared about him and wanted him to feel valued and protected. Mrs. Rodriguez, the school counselor, continued to work with Tommy to help him process what had happened and rebuild his sense of security. She used art therapy and play therapy to help him express his feelings about the incident and to reinforce the message that he belonged and was valued. "Tommy is remarkably resilient," she told David and me. "During one of our children often are, but what's really helping him heal is seeing how many adults in his life are willing to stand up for him and protect him. That's teaching him that what Robert did was an aberration, not the norm." She was right. Tommy was gradually returning to his normal, confident self. He still had moments of anxiety and questions about belonging, but they were becoming less frequent. More importantly, he was learning to trust that David and I would protect him, and that he had value regardless of what one bitter, prejudiced man thought about him. The retake of his class photo went beautifully. Mrs. Patterson made sure Tommy was positioned prominently in the front row, right between his best friends Marcus and Lily. When the photographer asked the children to smile, Tommy's grin was genuine and bright, the smile of a child who knew he belonged exactly where he was. 3 months after the photo incident, we received an unexpected visitor. David's Aunt Margaret, Robert's sister, showed up at our door on a Saturday afternoon with a serious expression and a manila envelope in her hands. "I need to talk to you both," she said, without preamble, about Robert and what happened at Tommy's school. Margaret had always been the more progressive member of David's extended family, but she generally stayed out of family conflicts. Her presence at our door suggested that Robert's behavior had created ripples beyond our immediate family circle. We invited her in and offered coffee while Tommy played in his room, giving us privacy to talk. Margaret sat at our kitchen table and opened the envelope, revealing printed copies of emails and text messages. "I've been getting pressure from Robert to talk sense into you about this whole situation," she began. "He's been sending me messages for weeks, trying to get me to convince you to stop overreacting and bring Tommy around for family events." She spread some of the printed messages across the table, but the more he talked, the more I realized how deep his prejudice really goes. "Look at this." The messages were worse than I'd expected. Robert had written things about Tommy that were so cruel and dehumanizing that I felt sick reading them. He'd referred to my son as the bastard, Sarah's baggage, and a constant reminder of David's poor judgment. He'd expressed hope that David would come to his senses and start a real family soon. "I've known my brother for 65 years, Margaret said, her voice heavy with sadness and disgust. "I've seen him be stubborn and traditional, but I've never seen him be deliberately cruel to a child. What he did at that school, and what he's been saying in these messages, it's unforgivable." She looked directly at me. "I want you to know that not everyone in David's family feels the way Robert does. Tommy is my great-nephew, and I love him. What Robert did was wrong, and I support your decision to protect Tommy from that kind of treatment." Margaret's validation meant more than I could express. It confirmed that we weren't overreacting or being unreasonable in our response to Robert's behavior. It also gave Tommy another family member who truly accepted and loved him. "There's something else," Margaret continued. "Robert has been telling people that you're keeping Tommy away from him out of spite, that you're using the child to punish him for not immediately accepting your marriage. I wanted you to know that I've been correcting that narrative whenever I hear it. What happened wasn't about your marriage or your feelings. It was about protecting a child from someone who has demonstrated that he's willing to harm that child to make a point." As we approached the one-year anniversary of the photo incident, I reflected on how much our lives had changed. Tommy was thriving in school, surrounded by friends and teachers who valued him. David had grown stronger in his role as Tommy's father, no longer torn between his loyalty to his dad and his responsibility to his son. And I had learned that family isn't just about blood relations, it's about the people who choose to love and protect each other. Robert had made his choice clear. Despite multiple opportunities to apologize and change his behavior, he had doubled down on his prejudice and cruelty. He'd missed Tommy's 8th birthday, his school play, his soccer games, and countless other milestones. He'd chosen his pride and his narrow definition of family over a relationship with his son and grandson. The cost of that choice became apparent when David received a call from his father's neighbor. Robert had fallen and broken his hip, and he was in the hospital asking for David. When we arrived at the hospital, we found a man who looked older and more frail than his 66 years, lying in a bed surrounded by the consequences of his own choices. "David," he said weakly when he saw his son, "I'm glad you came." David sat down beside the bed, and I could see the conflict in his face, love for his father warring with anger over what Robert had done to our family. "How are you feeling, Dad?" "Old," Robert admitted. "Lonely. I've had a lot of time to think lying here." For a moment, I thought he might actually acknowledge what he'd done, might finally show some remorse for the pain he'd caused Tommy. But then he continued, "I've been thinking about how we can put this whole misunderstanding behind us. Maybe it's time for you to bring the boy around again. I'm sure he's forgotten all about that school thing by now." The casual dismissal of Tommy's trauma, the reduction of deliberate cruelty to a school thing, made it clear that Robert still didn't understand or accept what he'd done wrong. He wanted reconciliation on his terms, without accountability or change. David's response was quiet but firm. "Dad, what you did to Tommy wasn't a misunderstanding, and he hasn't forgotten it. Until you can acknowledge that you deliberately hurt a child and show genuine remorse for that, we can't move forward." Robert's face hardened. "I see that woman has really gotten her claws into you. You're choosing her bastard over your own father." And there it was again, the same prejudice, the same cruelty, the same refusal to see Tommy as a real person deserving of love and respect. Nothing had changed except Robert's circumstances. David stood up. "Tommy is my son, Dad, legally, emotionally, and in every way that matters. If you can't accept that and treat him with basic human decency, then we have nothing more to talk about. We left the hospital that day knowing that the door was still open if Robert ever chose to walk through it with genuine remorse and changed behavior. But we also knew that we couldn't wait for that day or sacrifice Tommy's well-being hoping for it today. As I write this story, Tommy is 9 years old and thriving. He's confident, happy, and secure in the knowledge that he is loved and valued by the people who matter. He still occasionally asks about Grandpa Robert, but without the desperate longing for approval that used to break my heart. He's learned that some people aren't capable of love, and that their limitations don't reflect his worth. David has become the father Tommy always deserved, protective, loving, and unwavering in his commitment to our family. The crisis with his father, painful as it was, clarified his priorities and strengthened his resolve to put his wife and son first. We've built a chosen family around Tommy that includes my sister Jessica, David's Aunt Margaret, Mrs. Henderson, and other teachers who've become mentors, and the parents and children from school who've embraced him as one of their own. This family is based not on blood or obligation, but on love, respect, and mutual support. The school photo from that retake day hangs in our living room now. Tommy, beaming in the front row, surrounded by his classmates, looking like he belongs exactly where he is. Because he does, we all do. Robert made his choice that day, in the gymnasium. When he decided that his prejudice was more important than a child's well-being, we made our choice too, to protect our son, to demand respect for our family, and to build our lives around people who choose love over hate. Sometimes I wonder if Robert ever thinks about what he's missing. Tommy's laugh, his artwork, his stories about school, his hugs, and his unconditional love. Tommy would have loved him if given the chance, but Robert chose to see him as an obstacle rather than a gift. And that choice cost him everything. The principal's email that day wasn't just about policy changes or it was about a community standing up for a child and saying that discrimination and cruelty have no place in spaces where children should feel safe and valued. It was about the power of institutions and individuals to protect the vulnerable and hold adults accountable for their actions. Tommy learned important lessons from this experience, that he has worth regardless of what others think, that there are adults who will fight for him, and that family is defined by love and choice rather than blood and tradition. These are lessons that will serve him well as he grows up in a world that doesn't always treat children with the respect and protection they deserve. As for me, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set firm boundaries, even when it's painful. I learned that protecting your child from toxic family members isn't cruel, it's necessary. And I learned that there are more good people in the world than bad, more people willing to stand up for what's right than to stay silent in the face of cruelty. The day Robert removed Tommy from those photos was the day our real family story began. Not the family defined by his narrow prejudices and cruel limitations, but the family we chose to build based on love, respect, and the radical idea that every child deserves to belong.